An important session on symptom management. Breathlessness is one of the common symptoms that the patients are afraid of, and many of us, many patients, and even including us, if we have experienced breathlessness, we are afraid to face the situation. Uh, so, in patients with carcinoma lung, this is one of the common symptoms. But even in other malignancies also, many patients have breathlessness, and patients near end of life have also breathlessness. So there are many important things that we need to know about breathlessness. So today's session will be handled by Dr. Raja Meyer, who is a pulmonologist um, from Mumbai. She is working in palliative care as well as a pulmonologist in Hinduja Hospital and Bhatia Hospital. So she has been helping us with various sessions in FCPM and in other ECOS as well. So welcome you, madam, and it's over to you.
Sir, Dr. Rajam have lost. I think there is some internet connectivity issue there. She's trying to log in soon.
I'm not sure if all of you can hear me well. That's more important than seeing me. I'm going to share my screen now. Welcome to this session of ECHO. As you all know that I am a pulmonologist, it gives me great joy to talk on this topic. And I'm not sure how many days you all have been attending these sessions. So a lot of you might be familiar with some of the things that I speak about. So I will talk to you today. The main broad headings would be, Sunil, can everybody see the screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, yes.
And audio is fine?
Yes.
Yeah, audio is fine.
Okay. So today, broadly, what I'm going to talk to you all about is the need for palliative care approach in respiratory conditions. Second, of course, is what is exactly chronic breathlessness syndrome. Can you all see me? Hello?
We can hear you, ma'am.
Yeah, fine. Okay. Because suddenly I lost that panel. Anyway. And also we are going to tell you about how we can use morphine. And lastly, about how we can manage other respiratory symptoms. Okay. So the need for palliative approach in respiratory symptoms. So historically, palliative care was actually started, as you all know, in the late 1960s by Dame Cicely Saunders. And she was the one who started the St. Christopher's Hospice, which was mainly done for patients with cancer and advanced cancer. So historically, everybody believed, even there are many people who still think that cancer is the reason or is the main disease that requires palliative care. So we need to realize, if you look at the number of Indians affected by many conditions besides cancer, so if you see this little chart, you can see that between TB, asthma, infectious diseases, hepatitis, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, etc., they form a chunk of number of Indians who are actually exposed to this particular various other illnesses besides cancer. Cancer does affect about 0.15% of Indians, but if you see, the bulk of other conditions are the ones that really affect Indians. And we cannot afford to ignore palliative care in these conditions also. The reason being that in India, especially in respiratory diseases, India has 18% of the world's population, and almost the double number of patients suffer from chronic respiratory diseases. So the burden of respiratory diseases in India is very, very high. It's close to 1/3 of the world's burden. And you can also see that in the context of the COVID, where even that burden is increasing, and we've already come to the number 2 on the list. Also, we must remember that we are now an aging population. Presently, our country is not. But in 30 years' time, our 60-year-olds will increase by 300% and 80-year-olds will increase by 700%. So we must remember that we are an aging population, and we need to therefore realize that elderly will be more subjected to issues with the respiratory conditions. So and also the number of people suffering from respiratory conditions, especially the most common, which is breathlessness, is a staggering 75 million worldwide, of which more than 90% of these patients are with the respiratory illnesses. And we also need to remember that cancer, cardiac conditions, all of these contribute to patients with breathlessness. Okay? So coming to the different areas which do cause breathlessness. Coming to the various causes of breathlessness, we need to realize that it could be any of the conditions, for example, mainly respiratory, like chronic obstructive lung disease, various etiologies of interstitial lung disease, cardiac causes like congestive cardiac failure due to age, valvular lesions, ischemic heart disease, as well as valvular lesions. Then there are conditions which affect the muscles, for example, motor neuron disease. Then so they come into the category of neurology, as well as those patients with advanced local cancers, so lymphangitis carcinomatosis or pleural effusion. And also when you have patients with any cancer, they suffer from cachexia and anorexia, and that leads to muscle loss, which can lead the patient to be breathless because of deconditioning. Now, just to highlight, I'm sure you'll have seen this graph before, just to highlight even more to you the need for having or talking about palliative care in non-cancerous conditions. So I'm not sure if you see this graph, you have 4 graphs which you can by and large fit in people who die in the world. So unfortunately, only 7% of people die suddenly, and these sudden deaths are more commonly seen under the age group of 50. Now, when you go to the terminal illness, which is typically the graph number 2 or graph B, where it is the graph seen in cancer patients, where patients maintain a decent, good quality of life and then suddenly dip to their death. And it is seen that most of the patients who receive palliative care are cancer patients. But what we have to focus today on is graph C, where we have patients with organ failure, which could be renal, liver, heart, neurology, as well as respiratory. These patients are diagnosed much earlier and they suffer the prolonged symptom burden for a very long time, sometimes in dementia for over 10 years, in COPD for 15 years, in probably interstitial lung for 5 years, in CKD from anything from 2 to 5 years. So these patients have a slow dipping, poor quality of life. Each admission, which you can see on the graph, each dip could have been a potential death, but modern medicine props them back. But they never ever come back to their original quality of life. So these are the patients who for a long period of time suffer. They do not have good quality life. Plus, they're in and out of hospitals, and they not only suffer physically, but financially, emotionally, psychologically, and socially. And please do remember, it's not just the patient who suffers. In India, it's the whole family, not just in India, everywhere around the world. But I think in India, the involvement is more because the patient actually lives with you. So including the life of the family is completely out of gear. It's completely centered around the patient. Therefore, by definition, the health-related suffering of this patient and his family is immense. And that is what palliative care is all about, to identify and acknowledge and try and reduce the health-related suffering. How can we make journeys of these patients much more comfortable? Pharmacology is available, yet patients suffer a lot. They have a lot of distress. In fact, it's very commonly said that patients with respiratory illnesses die a social death even before a physical one, because they're so crippled. They're not able to do things independently. They're sometimes oxygen dependent. Sometimes these patients are on non-invasive ventilators. So these are the kind of people who actually require, and if you see that number of people affected by COPD, TB, diabetes, heart diseases and stroke, it comes to a staggering 40% of Indians. So a lot of us will require palliative care as we go ahead, because almost only 1 amongst 10 of us will die suddenly. The rest of the 90 will go through a bedbound phase. And the last graph, when you see, is just 1 second. Huh? Just 1 second. என்னது can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am, we can.
So the last graph is what we are going to see commonly. It is for those patients who are going to grow older and just the age-related degeneration. For example, they just become frailer and frailer and they wither away. And these are the kind of patients who actually account to close to 50% of the way people die. So it's important to have the difficult conversations, because these people do not become 85 and 90 overnight. These are the kind of people who are the ones who should be spoken to about how they would like to be treated at the end of life. So you see, the scope of palliative care is immense in non-cancer conditions. Every physician trained, whether in general practice or specialty, should be able to think of palliative care and should be able to introduce the concept with the patient and the family, and then refer to specialists whenever the need arises. So coming to breathlessness per se, what are the types of breathlessness? It can be actually classified depending on the onset of breathlessness, which is acute breathlessness, acute on chronic, and chronic breathlessness. Now, the purview of our topic is essentially chronic breathlessness. Why is that? Because acute breathlessness does need immediate attention. It might be the first time in the patient's life and you really don't know why he's so breathless. While the second and third probably needs the palliative care approach. Because sometimes your patients with chronic obstructive lung disease or those with advanced interstitial lung disease can get suddenly breathless. So they can have something called an acute on chronic. So these are the kind of patients you need to identify and start talking to the patient's relatives, because you as a doctor have seen more patients of COPD and seen more patients of interstitial lung. So you have the responsibility and the experience to foresee and foretell the natural course of the illness of this patient. So it is your onus to say that usually these patients don't do very well, or when they have repeated admissions to the hospital, it's your duty to inform the patient and the family that repeated hospitalizations is not going to improve the quality of life of the patient, and that should be the focus of all human beings. It's a birthright to live well and not necessarily live long with prolonged distressing symptoms. The other way of assessment of breathlessness is by the various scales. I'm sure all the doctors today know about the New York Heart Association, the Modified Medical Research Council, and the Borg scale. So I'll just briefly run through it. And Rajalakshmi, please tell them to put it on the chat box if they have any questions, and we can even discuss things towards the end. Because it's very difficult on a digital platform to see your reactions, but I would love an interactive session if it is towards the end. So just to briefly run through what is New York Heart Association, it's basically divided into class 1 to 4. It's just revising what you already know. And please remember that this is available very freely on the net, so we won't delve too much on this. But this is how you grade your patients with a cardiac illness. When it comes to a respiratory illness and they complain of breathlessness, you use the term as grade, and the assessment scale is Modified Medical Research Council. This is what is used very, very widely, and you can easily put your patients from grade 1 to grade 4. So it gives you an assessment of how your patient is progressing, how soon your patient is progressing from one to the next grade. Okay. So once you have a patient of breathlessness, how are you going to evaluate? So the most important thing is obviously it is history. Very, very important, because you need to find out the smoking history, whether he has worked in a polluted environment. So you need to go through that. You need to find out whether there's a family history, so it tends towards allergy and asthma. So a detailed history is extremely important. Second thing is also about, it also give you an idea whether it's a pulmonary history or a cardiac history or a neurological history. So please, I cannot emphasize more on how important a detailed history is. Followed by that, of course, clinical examination, which should be impeccable. And ideally, we examine a respiratory patient on a stool so that we can see the patient from the front and from the back. Very, very important to remember these things. And it's always nice to do the inspection, palpation, auscultation, and percussion and auscultation, because there are simple ways in finding out what the disease is by simply examining the patient. For example, the dictum in respiratory medicine is the side that moves less is the affected side. So depending on just watching the patient and take a deep breath, if you know that the right side is moving less, you can close your eyes and say that this disease, the patient has a disease on the right side. You obviously confirm it with a chest x-ray. These days, of course, it is also followed by a CT scan. Besides this, to be sure it's the lung, you should get an ECG done, a 2D echo done, and a detailed lung function test. Now, very often the lung function test is not used very widely in private practice, and it's mostly, set to the hospitals. While I think family physicians can get a portable lung function and get immense information about their patients with a lung function test. So of course, lung function test, doing it and evaluating it is a separate topic on its own, but it's important to include lung function test in your list of investigations. And to complete the investigations, an arterial blood gas gives you an idea whether the patient is in type 1 or type 2 respiratory failure, especially if he is constantly breathless. And it's a good idea to do it because then you will know how much oxygen to give these patients. So any doubts or any queries or any chat till now?
Nothing till now, doctor.
Anybody?
Okay. So are you all clear? Are you all with me? You can even show a reaction if you're like, because it's usually nice to have an interactive session, unless you want to stop me to say something else or repeat something else. So please let me know. So going ahead, when we talk about patients with breathlessness, so during our MBBS training and during even my PG training, we were taught about asking onset, duration, progress, what makes it better, what makes it worse, when do you get breathless, what do you do when you get breathless, smoking history, etc. When I started training for palliative care is when I realized there's so much going on behind the patient's mind when the patient is breathless, because it is a complete loss of independence. When the patient is chronically breathless and not able to do activities of daily living, he is dependent on his family members. He's not able to go to the toilet on his own. He's not able to talk on the phone. He's not able to open the doorbell, pick up the phone. There's so much dependence that the patient has a sense of loss of role. One person who used to be the earning member of the family, who used to be the head of the family, suddenly has become so dependent and suddenly feels, almost like a burden to his family. So plus he's not able to go out, meet his friends, so he's socially isolated. Like I mentioned before, very often patients with respiratory illness die a death socially because all his friends are old and he's not able to go out of his health because of his health. And therefore, it is extremely important to think about their mental framework also when they are breathless. Because all this can lead to frustration, anger, depression, insomnia. They're constantly scared about what's going to happen and how they're going to die and how painful that death is going to be. So this is a very interesting model that has been described by one of the palliative care physicians, that all your patients...
Did we lose her?
No, sir, we can hear. What about the rest participants? All can hear, right?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear.
Yes, yes, we are able to hear.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. So if whenever you have patients who are chronically breathless, who have an advanced lung disease or advanced congestive cardiac failure or even motor neuron disease, etc., these patients, you must explore what they are thinking, because a patient who is chronically breathless has an increased respiratory rate. He constantly uses his accessory muscles of respiration, and that sets up this whole vicious cycle of thoughts about dying, anxiety and distress, the feeling of helplessness, the feeling of hopelessness. Because of these two things, he gets more and more bedbound. And by getting more and more bedbound and reduced activity, he loses his muscle mass, which we call as deconditioning, which means it's a simple word. If you don't use it, you lose it. So because of this, he loses more of his muscle mass, and then even a little bit of activity makes us more breathless. So this whole vicious cycle is what the patient gets caught in. First of all, the underlying pathological condition that gets him more anxious, more dependent, more bedbound, more frustrated, less activity leading to more deconditioning, more breathless. So this is what we need to explore. And I realized that in my history taking, only as a chest physician, I used to never explore this. My questioning used to stop with the breathing. I never asked him how he's coping with his breathing. How does he sleep? Or is he having low mood? Is he depressed? Is he frustrated? These are the questions you really need to ask your patients, because the patient also feels much cared for when you're going beyond what you see, obviously. So it's very, very important that you see these things, right? So in connection with this chronic breathlessness, another very interesting paper has been published, and an interesting concept has been published, which is called as chronic breathlessness syndrome, which is very important for you all to register as a new entity. So chronic breathlessness syndrome is considered defined when a patient continues to be breathless despite being on optimum medical treatment, or rather maximum optimal medical treatment. And even the breathlessness contributes not just to his physical issues, but also affecting him psychologically, socially, and it's not necessarily how long he is. So just to simplify this, it is, suppose a patient of COPD, he gets diagnosed at the age of 65. And from the age of 65 to 70, with pulmonary rehabilitation, physiotherapy, quitting smoking, inhalers, he's been fine. Slowly from the age of 70 or 72, when his activities decrease or when he becomes more and more breathless, he then reaches a stage where he's chronically breathless. He's on his inhalers, he's taking the vaccinations, he's meeting his pulmonologist, but still the patient continues to be breathless. These are the patients who will fit into chronic breathlessness syndrome. And it's important to identify this, because these are the patients who we need to focus on improving their quality of life. So imagine you see a patient, or you have a relative at home who's bedbound on oxygen, who's not able to talk a bit of a sentence, who's not able to do anything. These patients need to be explored about what they think, how they are thinking, whether they're depressed, and their breathlessness must be addressed. And how do we address? So another very important principle of palliative care, as you all know, is to correct the correctables. Whatever is reversible, we must do it. And also you need to try what is non-pharmacological. Simple things like sitting in a well-ventilated room, loose clothes, you can blow a fan onto the face, teach the patient some positioning like bending forward, or some people who like to be propped up. So different positions can be tried. Patients can also be taught relaxation techniques like breathing techniques, or distraction like music therapy, or certain massages. All this can be used to relieve distressing symptoms by some extent, at least. Helps to distract the patient. So this helps in the non-pharmacological. The pharmacological treatment for breathlessness, of course, you all know about bronchodilators. You all know about steroids, nebulizers. Please use oxygen as a drug. Just by giving oxygen for all breathless patients is not scientific. Only when you document a low oxygen saturation on the pulse oximeter or blood gas, you should administer oxygen. Second important thing is you should maintain an oxygen level between 88 and 92 in patients with advanced lung diseases. You do not need to achieve a 98 or a 100. So you need to maintain only between 88 and 92. If you have such a suspecting an infection, you must start the patient on antibiotics depending on culture sensitivity. And in interstitial lung disease patients, there's good evidence to continue the pirfenidone, which is an antifibrotic, which delays the fibrosis. It might not necessarily reverse the fibrosis, but it delays the fibrosis. So there's good evidence that it improves survival, not necessarily the quality of life. The most important medication that you can give in chronic breathlessness syndrome after adapting to optimum pharmacological treatment as well as non-pharmacological measures is morphine. Whenever I have discussed about morphine amongst pulmonologists, they get shocked and they fall off their chair. Morphine being a narcotic and the common sense being that it's commonly used in patients who have pain, especially cancer pain. But low dose morphine is safe, is very, very effective in controlling chronic breathlessness syndrome. And I can actually call it a wonder drug because those patients who were wheelchair bound, who couldn't complete sentences, who needed assistance to go to the toilet, can to some extent manage independently, and a return of independence makes their quality of life much, much better. Also, I'll go on to the doses of morphine later, and the maximum we use for such patients who have advanced lung disease with chronic breathlessness is NIV, which is non-invasive ventilators like the bi-level positive airway pressure ventilator and the continuous positive airway pressure ventilator. So as pulmonologists with patients with advanced lung diseases and who are in chronic respiratory failure, we actually do not think these patients are good candidates for ICU and aggressive invasive ventilation therapy. Therefore, it's important to discuss these things as a part of your difficult dialogues and conversations with patients so that unnecessary aggressive treatment is not done and medical futility is not done, because you already know we rank so poorly in the quality of death index. So we should select patients carefully going to ICU. So let me talk a little bit of why there's so much of morphine phobia. Everybody thinks that morphine causes respiratory depression and death and addiction. In indicated patients, so those with pain and those with chronic breathlessness, the morphine attaches to the mu receptors and there is no chance of addiction. The patient requires it. It is like giving insulin to a diabetic. Secondly, what does morphine do? It decreases the work of breathing. It decreases the respiratory rate. It improves the hypoxia and it does not cause hypercapnia or respiratory depression. So it does not alter the anatomy of the lungs. It does not change the COPD or the interstitial lung. It does not change the cardiac failure. What it does is makes the patient feel less breathless. So the sensation of breathlessness decreases. So instead of the patient feeling, the patient probably feels a little less breathless. So please remember, another biggest mantra of palliative care is start low, go slow. We always start with the bare minimum dose and slowly increase weekly by 25%, more cautiously in patients with lung disease or for breathlessness. So how do we use morphine? If you can see this flowchart, Rajalakshmi also has this slide so she can share it with all of you. Please remember that since the half-life of morphine is 4 hourly, we give it 4 hourly at very, very basic dose, and we don't exceed a dose of more than 30 milligrams for breathlessness. And we do not reach the 30 milligrams immediately. It is usually started slowly. So some of the tips that we give is, if you're going to give oral doses, give quarter tablet of morphine. Usually the tablet is 10 milligrams. In Mumbai, we do not get prolonged release. We do not get sustained release. We get only immediate release. So we use 2.5 milligrams twice a day. And then slowly increase it to 3 times and 4 times. Follow up and routinely monitor the patient and always prescribe a laxative. More so in patients who are with chronic breathlessness, they can't afford to be constipated. So you must use a laxative. And if you suspect a lot of anxiety, please use a medium-acting benzodiazepine like lorazepam. And all these medications can be given subcutaneously or orally in patients who are not able to take orally. So very important to treat the morphine, because very often patients also say, I don't have pain, I don't have advanced cancer, why are you giving me morphine? Very often patients say, I don't want to get addicted to morphine. So please remember that in indicated patients, there is no addiction. In that phase of life where patients in advanced lung disease, they need the morphine for quality of life. So very, very important. There are enough researches done. One of them I've shown you here, that it's very, very significant, and oral or parenteral opioids are way better than nebulizers. There is not, in the 4 years that I have practiced, not a single case of respiratory depression or a case of high carbon dioxide. Any questions, Rajalakshmi?
There was a question on type 1 and type 2 respiratory failure.
Okay, so type 1 respiratory failure is when you have only low saturation, which is oxygen. So when your PaO2, partial pressure of oxygen, is less, it is type 1 respiratory failure. And that is mainly the causes are lung. Type 2 respiratory failure is when low oxygen is associated with high carbon dioxide or hypercapnia. And those causes can be anywhere from the head to the lung. For example, if you have a patient with a stroke, or a patient with motor neuron disease, or a patient with, for example, a patient with chronic bronchitis. So it could be a pump failure is type 2 respiratory failure, while a lung failure is type 1 respiratory failure. Is that clear? Any other questions, Sunil?
No, madam.
Okay. So going on to what is terminal breathlessness. So terminal breathlessness is that what you must identify, because this is what directly signifies a quality of death. We need to improve the quality of life of these patients till death. So what are we meaning by this? These patients are struggling. They are like fish out of water. And in such patients, we use a combination of morphine and midazolam as a subcutaneous infusion, which can be given over 24 hours. And depending how the patient settles, we give the patient slowly increase the dose. And usually terminal breathlessness is not given for more than 12 to 24 to maximum 48 hours, because these are carefully selected patients who are in the active phase of dying. And if you do this well, there's also an entity called as palliative sedation, which probably will not be needed if you aggressively control your patient's symptoms with subcutaneous infusions with morphine and midazolam. We give bare minimum doses of these two medications because the intent is to cause comfort of the patient. The intent is not anything else but to give the patient comfort, keep the patient comfortable during his last days, and automatically the relatives also will be comfortable. But the minute you have a patient who's uncomfortable, the relatives are jumping around, the relatives then want to rush to casualty, and then everything else happens like a spiral. Intubation, central line, arterial line, and all of that, which is not indicated in patients who have chronic organ failure, who have been in and out of hospitals, and who have been leading a prolonged poor quality of life. Okay? So the other thing you need to also focus on in patients with chronic respiratory diseases is secretions. It can be extremely distressing to have a lot of secretions in these patients, and instead of doing constant suction, etc., what we can use is actually two medications, which is hyoscine, which is your Buscopan, or glycopyrrolate, which can be used in the doses of 20 to 40 microgram hyoscine, 0.2 to 0.4 milligram of glycopyrrolate to decrease the secretions. So please do refer to your pharmacological books as to how it can be used, and it can be again given orally or subcutaneously, because it again improves the quality of the life of the patient because you decrease the secretions and you don't keep making the patient is not constantly coughing on productive sputum. So that comes to the end of breathlessness. I'm going to just quickly run I'm conscious of time and I know there's a case presentation also. So I will just run past these symptoms which you commonly see in an outpatient department. That is basically cough. And please do remember it's one of the commonest 5 top most symptoms seen in the outpatient clinic of a general physician. So it is extremely important to recognize and the fact that cough can cause a lot of issues. And cough need not necessarily come from the chest. It can be a cardiac cause. It's called even a gastric reflux. Sometimes ENT causes. It also could be due to treatment like chemotherapy drugs or radiation or any other medications like ACE inhibitors. So there are multiple reasons why you can get a refractory cough. The different types of cough, I don't need to tell doctors who are dealing in the OPD daily, wet cough, dry cough, etc. And the importance is it actually gives you a clue of what the reason of the cough is. So if you have a productive cough, you know it's airway condition or a pneumonia. If you have a dry cough, it's an interstitial or a pleural or a mediastinal issue where there is no mucus production. Okay, so you need to know how do you treat these coughs. So simple measurements, of course, are you treat the condition. So you treat the airway disease, you treat the interstitial disease, you tap the pleural fluid. Those things should be given. When you have a refractory cough, again, low dose morphine helps. Sometimes even a local treatment like lozenges, those things also relieve the patient. But suppose it keeps going on, one drug that has been suggested is anti-anxietic drugs. So you can use citalopram, you can use lorazepam, and one important thing that you could use is gabapentin. Codeine these days is not easily available, especially in Mumbai. Codeine is not available, but gabapentin, which is an anti-epileptic medication, also used in neuropathic pain, has been tried as a treatment of intractable cough. So many of my patients of interstitial lung disease, whose main symptom is distressing cough, do quite well with gabapentin, because one of the side effects of gabapentin also is sedation. So if you give it in the night, they're able to sleep well, and they also therefore get up more refreshed with decreased cough. So the different things you can do for cough is, of course, correct the correctables. You can give local lozenges, etc. You can try codeine, 15 to 30 milligrams, 3 to 4 times a day. You can try low dose oral morphine like you will in breathlessness. You can also use gabapentin in refractory cough. So those are the simple things about cough. And like I said, that when you have a patient with chronic cough, you should not restrict your etiology to the lung. Explore the options to drugs, medications, cardiac, gastro, ENT, etc. Or psychogenic cough. Then the other symptom that we commonly see as respiratory physicians is pleural effusion. You know the difference between transsudates and exudates. And obviously very common cause of pleural effusion in the country is TB, besides the malignant pleural effusions. Other than this, of course, you can have trauma, embolus, and the main reason why these patients have problems is because it leads to a lung collapse and it leads to a ventilation perfusion mismatch. And a large amount of fluid can displace the mediastinum and thereby cause a lot of breathlessness to the patient. I don't need to go to the causes of pleural effusion. I'm sure all of you know about it. But how do you manage? Now, managing pleural effusion is again dependent on the cause. So if you have a small pleural effusion, you basically can observe it. But suppose you have a moderate to a large pleural effusion, then mostly it is, and if it is recurring and refilling like it does in cancer patients, then you need to treat depending on the prognosis of the patient. So if the patient's prognosis is good, that is his overall performance status, his cancer situation is good, then you can do an intervention like a small intercostal drain or a pigtail, and you can fuse the 2 layers of the pleura. But suppose the prognosis is poor, then you can do an aspiration to just give the patient temporary relief. So it's important that you do the procedure depending on the prognosis of the patient. You cannot treat all patients in the same way, because the actively dying patient should be kept comfortable, and you do minimum interventions for them. For a patient with good prognosis, you can put a small indwelling catheter or a pigtail or a small intercostal drainage. And when we talk of fusing of the 2 layers of the pleura, we talk of talc or powderage, where we cause intense inflammation between the two layers, so much so that they cause active inflammation and adherence, and then it totally obviates the potential space. So there is no fluid, there's no chance for the fluid to collect. So again, I said, like, it depends on the cause, and it's also managed depending on the patient's performance status. I think it's almost the last of the symptom, which is hemoptysis. Again, a very distressing symptom, most commonly seen in patients with TB and cancer, and a lot of patients post-TB because of the fibrosis. And how do patients die in hemoptysis? One, because they lose blood, but two, more importantly, they drown in their own blood. And that's the reason it is more of asphyxiation that these patients die of. And it's very, very scary. And you need to be prepared as to how you're going to treat this patient. So there are various things that you can do. We do bronchial artery embolization, where it's done by the radiologist, where that bronchial artery is this thing by a gel foam so it doesn't bleed. The other things you can do is endoscopically. You can put adrenaline, you can do laser, you can do brachytherapy, you can do cryotherapy. So this is, of course, the purview of interventional pulmonologists who do active management of large quantities of bleeding. What is important to remember is what you can do as a family physician is you can prepare the patient for bleeding. You can tell the patient to use dark colored towels, because white made the blood looks even more scary. So use dark colored towels, reassure the patient, and you can use tranexamic acid as an antifibrinolytic, which can be started as 1.5 milligram stat and then given 3 times a day. And you can give maximum 3 doses, 1.5 milligram each. And you can always start again if after a week of giving this treatment. The last symptom is hiccup, which is mainly due to diaphragm contraction. That's why I've taken it up here. But the cause of hiccup is mainly gastric reflux and acidity, and you need to investigate the causes and neutralize the acidity of for the patient. So you can use anti-flatulence, you can use PPIs, you can use baclofen, as well as other dopamine antagonists like metoclopramide. So that is all the symptoms about respiratory care. So I will stop sharing and we will go to I don't think I can still start my audio. Am I heard well or no?
Yeah.
Now it's okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So there was a question
yes.
Regarding whether we can give morphine in both type 1 and type 2 respiratory failure.
Yes, you can give. See, ideally, whenever you use morphine, it has to be given with strict prescription. You need to be sure who's providing that medication to the patient. The doses need to be reviewed regularly. So it's safe because it doesn't worsen the type 2 respiratory failure. When given in small doses, it is very, very safe. And you don't need to keep monitoring blood gases, because these are patients who are mainly palliative. So you don't keep poking the patient with doing the blood gas because it's extremely painful. You can use, because usually these patients with type 2 respiratory failure are also on BiPAP. They are on non-invasive ventilation to wash out the carbon dioxide. So it's safe to use the morphine. Low dose morphine is safe. It does not worsen the hypercapnia.
Yeah. So can we, do we need to convince the family before palliative sedation?
So yes, so actually there is a bit of a debate with palliative sedation. So to be honest with you, if you aggressively control the symptoms with subcutaneous infusion of morphine and midazolam, maybe you don't need to go to the step of palliative sedation. So, there are people who believe that you should not be having palliative sedation at all if you aggressively control your symptoms well. Having said that, in some small percent of cases, if you really need the palliative sedation, yes, communication is very, very important, because following the palliative sedation, your patient becomes unresponsive, and that is a big deal for relatives. So it has to be clearly communicated, documented, and signed by the relatives so that you're sure that they understand what you mean by palliative sedation. Because once the patient becomes unresponsive, Sometimes they can say, because of your injection, this happened to the patient. The point of the injection, the intent of the injection is to make the patient comfortable. The fallout of that is that the patient may die. I'm sure all of you have heard about the doctrine of double effect. So you have to explain these things, that the patient dies because of his underlying condition, not because of the medication. The doses of the medication you're giving is so small that its only aim is to keep the patient comfortable. It is not to kill the patient, because that is what is most important in palliative sedation. So if you aggressively control your patient's symptoms, you probably don't need palliative sedation. There are some other questions I can see about COVID. Yeah.
If a patient complains of coughing out small bouts of blood along with sputum 2 to 3 times per day, what should be our plan of treatment?
So I think the history is the most important, whether there is, for example, whether the cough and the phlegm is associated with fever, evening rise, past history of tuberculosis, because sometimes a healed tuberculosis can give more blood. So you should ask those questions. Second thing is, again, whether there is history of pain in the throat, pain while swallowing, get a proper ENT examination, get a proper dental examination. Sometimes poor dental hygiene, patient might be spitting blood and you don't know whether it's coming from the chest or from the mouth. So X-ray is important, CT scan is important. Be sure you have ruled out the causes. Sometimes when patients bring out the blood, it could also be from the GI tract. So ask for abdominal symptoms, because sometimes patients might be swallowing blood from the chest, or they could be bringing out blood from the GI. So please ask for GI symptoms. Never put your differentials, if the patient has cough, breathlessness, hemoptysis, equal to respiratory. You must explore the neighboring organs, because any of those can present. So you must ask for fever, you must ask for weight loss, you must do a dental, ENT, get an X-ray, get a CT scan done. So very, very important.
What's your experience on antifibrotic in current COVID cases?
So it's a process of work in, we are still learning. We are seeing a lot of patients with post-COVID fibrosis, and it's a horrible thing to see, because these patients are requiring 10 to 15 liters of oxygen. They're all COVID negative. They can't go home. They cannot go out of the ICU because of the high flow oxygen they need. So we have started these patients on pirfenidone. Nintedanib is too expensive, so we can't give it in patients. We can't give it in all patients, but our experience has been limited because it's only 6 months down the pandemic, and those patients who survived the acute stage are the ones who are in this chronic fibrosis stage. We are still seeing a lot of them, and we have tried, but we have also lost patients because of chronic respiratory failure. So very early days, I'm sorry, maybe another 4 or 5 months we'll know how these patients are doing. Having said that, pirfenidone is not going to reverse the already existing fibrosis. What we know about pirfenidone is only delays the fibrosis. So patients have already had a huge cytokine storm and massive pulmonary inflammation leading to fibrosis. That fibrosis, the residual fibrosis, is not going to change with pirfenidone. The hope with pirfenidone is it doesn't worsen the progress of that fibrosis. So I hope, Dr. Sandeep, I have managed to explain your query.
So he was asking whether pirfenidone or nintedanib.
Yeah, I don't see, nintedanib is very, very expensive, and currently we have had experience. We have tried using only pirfenidone, but it's too early to tell you whether it's beneficial or not.
Is it oral or nebulization?
Oral medication.
Okay. So another question: hiccups can be very distressing and worsen the breathlessness. Yes. How to manage?
So hiccups, yes. So there are many things we can do. Again, certain non-pharmacological measures can be done. There is a vagal stimulation. Patients can be asked to drink water to dilute the acid. Patients can give a proper position. Patients can be asked to hold breath. And you can do what we used to do in the past is also Ryd's tube and neutralize the acid. So you can give PPIs, you can give lansoprazole, you can give Domstal so that the motility is in the other direction. So these things can be tried for hiccups.
Yeah. So shall I add something
There's
to
also
that?
another question, how to differentiate terminal breathlessness from worsening of COVID dyspnea if COVID testing is not available, practical. So Atul Suresh has asked me. So see, terminal breathlessness is a condition we use when you feel the patient is actively dying. So it could be seen in patients with cancer. It could be the last common pathway for most of our patients who die, not necessarily respiratory conditions. Now, what is the meaning of worsening of COVID dyspnea? Is this patient was fine, or for example, anybody, for example, any human being who's got COVID, if there's no COVID test positive. So the point here is we have reached a stage now, Atul, where all people should be considered as COVID positive unless proved otherwise. So you need to aggressively treat if you have, therefore, a patient with history of fever, sore throat, anosmia, and all the typical myalgia, CBC showing low WBC count, D-dimer high, LDH high. So typically fitting into COVID, where the worsening is in over 2, 3, 4 days, then you give active treatment for COVID like you would with remdesivir, with all the treatment. And if the patient continues to be breathless, then he fits into chronic breathlessness and you treat him with low dose morphine to keep him comfortable. Now, terminal breathlessness is something that you can use with all patients who are in their last phase of dying. So that is something that you will recognize with other signs of active dying, like temperature, like urine output, like pulse, like everything else. So COVID dyspnea is basically how you identify with other parameters pointing towards COVID. Give full-blown optimum COVID treatment. Even if then the patient is breathless, then you need to treat that patient also with low dose morphine and add midazolam if the patient is anxious. So like how you would treat a chronic breath. Somebody's asked how to decide terminal breathlessness. Now, the how to decide terminal breathlessness is a clinical acumen where how do you know the patient is actively dying? So, terminal breathlessness is despite increasing the oxygen levels, the patient's oxygen saturation is low, patient is comatose, patient's body temperature is low, respiratory is shallow, or it's kind strokes breathing, BP is not maintained, urine output is falling, so our patient is in delirium. So these are the ways where you identify patients are in and they continues to be breathless. So that is the way you identify. Do you want to add anything, Sunil?
No, I want to add something on
Yes.
hiccup.
Yeah, please.
As Madam told, the most common reason for hiccup is from GI tract itself. So usually a PPI along with a prokinetic agent would be enough to treat hiccup. But in certain situation, we may not be able to find out the cause. In such situation, we can use baclofen, which is very good medication to control hiccup. And there will be some reasons like hepatomegaly due to some tumor in the liver can irritate the diaphragm, and in such cases you have to use steroids to reduce the peritumor edema so that the irritation of the diaphragm can be decreased.
So
Okay.
another question from Susan.
Yeah.
Susan has asked about oxygen and terminal stage.
Yeah.
So if you are, you must remember, oxygen should be used if you have a documented low saturation or a low partial pressure of oxygen in the ABG. If you have done an ABG. So suppose it's a home setting and you see, so there is actually no role of oxygen if you have a oxygen saturation of anything above 88 to 90. So ethics is that what we feel as doctors is oxygen. If you put oxygen, patient and the family are feeling relieved, but that is only to treat their guilt. It is not a scientific reason. So unless you have a low oxygen, use of oxygen in the terminal is of no use. And please remember that oxygen is also a drug. It does cause nascent oxygen damage of the lung. So it's not a panacea for breathlessness. It is a panacea. It is a treatment only when you document low oxygen levels. Sandeep wants to ask another question, but you please keep a track of the time, Sunil. And Deepa has said about what about ventilators. So what about ventilators, Deepa? What do you want to ask? You can unmute and ask if it's faster to type.
Dr. Sandeep Kher.
Yes.
I want a specific question. Like you already answered my anti-fibrotic thing.
Yeah.
The current situation, the patient already is about 3 weeks post, and we are not able to wean him off from the oxygen.
Correct.
Minimum requirement is 3 liters. As
Correct.
he goes out of the oxygen, he drops to 89 or so.
Correct.
And so, what is your expertise advice to us how to manage home oxygen?
So, yeah, if the patient is able to manage at 3 liters, he definitely can go home. He should go on an oxygen concentrator. You can give him 3 liters per minute. You see if his oxygen levels are falling during activity, then increase the oxygen during activity like eating, walking, talking, sleeping, bathing, toilet. Next point, you can consider low dose morphine just to make him feel a little bit better. 2.5 milligrams twice a day, slowly increase to 3, 4 or 6 times a day, given laxatives and monitoring whether he's excessively drowsy or excessively sleepy. So go very slow. You can increase by even every weekly to 10 days. Pulmonary rehab. Have you seen that post-COVID rehab document?
No, I haven't.
Okay. I can send it to Rajalakshmi. She can send it to all of you. It's an excellent rehab article that you can send it to all your patients. It helps of what to eat and how to much exercise, all those things. So I will send it to Sunil or to Rajalakshmi and they can forward it to you. It's an excellent practical document to give your patient. This is the long tail of the COVID pandemic, where we are going to see this fibrosis for patients who have survived the initial insult. This is how they're going to behave is chronic pulmonary fibrosis. So you can try pirfenidone if you have a pulmonologist who can monitor the side effects and the doses of pirfenidone. But please, with 3 liters, he can safely go home and he can be on an oxygen concentrator.
But he's not as dyspneic in terms of aware of his breathless effort.
Then he needs rehab.
Yeah.
Just do rehab, put him on oxygen, give him all the nutrition, because I don't know how he's already been in hospital for so long. So he's definitely lost muscle mass. So nutrition, vaccinations, rehab and oxygen. If he's not breathless at rest or minimal activity, then maybe you can wait. And how old is the patient?
He's about 48.
So he's young and he has got no other comorbidities.
No comorbidities whatsoever. He had a severe cytokine storm, required
so this is what,
as well as plasma COVID, the convalescent plasma, and after that he deteriorated like anything.
So this is what we have seen now. Contrary to popular belief, young people between the age of 40 and 60 who are getting COVID, because of their strong immunity, are mounting a very strong cytokine response, going into ARDS, onto the ventilator, coming out with fibrosis. The elderly don't make it, and the young don't, and the ones with low immunity, the ones with other comorbidities like on low dose steroids for asthma, for rheumatoid arthritis, they are not even mounting such a strong response. It is this 40 to 60 who are mounting a very strong cytokine response and who are really suffering the post-COVID sequelae.
Thanks, doctor.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Deepa has asked, what about ventilators? When are ventilators used? So just one line thing, it is a very detailed answer. I cannot give it in today's session. But what I can tell you in today's session is we need to use ventilators judiciously. We need to use ventilators in type 1 and type 2 respiratory failure, or for those patients where the recovery is good. So it's no point putting a 90-year-old on a ventilator who's had dementia, who's been bedridden, or a COPD who has been admitted to hospital 8 to 10 times with hardly any respiratory reserve. So ventilators should be used when, for example, like a post in the COVID pneumonia or acute respiratory distress due to malaria, leptospirosis. So a lot of conditions where ventilators can be used, but selection of patient has to be judicious. You should select patients whom you can salvage. Unnecessary ventilators should be avoided. Yes, Sunil, over to you.
Okay, yeah. I think we will stop questions now. and will go on for patient story, which will be
Yes.
presented by Dr. Anupama, who is also a pulmonologist.
Oh, great. Hello.
She is a professor of pulmonology from PSG Institute of Medical Sciences, Coimbatore.
Okay. Good to see you.
Dr. Anupama, you can start with your presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. You're all able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, shall I start my presentation, ma'am?
Yes, please. Please don't call me madam.
Okay. Ma'am, this is we had a patient, a male patient. He was 66-year-old male patient. He came, diagnosis was idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis with chronic respiratory failure, moderate pulmonary hypertension, and systemic hypertension as his comorbidity. When he came to us, he had actually already cough of 1 year duration. He was dyspneic since 1 year. He had fatigue since 3 months. He was complaining of retrosternal chest pain and heartburn last 2 months with loss of appetite. So he was actually a retired headmaster. He was brought by his wife and son. Incidentally, son was a physiotherapist. He came to me in April 2018. When he came, his cough was actually, he said it is dry, intermittent since last 1 year. And it used to worsen, worsening was seen in the last 2 months. And mostly it was nocturnal worsening and as well as postprandial. He was also dyspneic. He had MRC grading was nearly 3/5. It was progressive over 1 year from grade 1 to grade 4. And Bog dyspnea scale was nearly 7/10 when I saw him first. He had fatigue, he had tiredness, even limitation of the regular activities since the last 1 month. He had retrosternal pain and heartburn last 2 months and loss of appetite. With these symptoms, he presented to his family physician who had been treating him actually as recurrent LRTI, and he was treated as COPD case actually with a lot of antibiotics and bronchodilators, but with not much great response. He is a known case of hypertension since the last 15 years on regular medication. No history suggested of any significant medical or surgical illness in the past. He was a non-smoker and no other addictions, and no family history of any respiratory illness in the family. On examination, he was moderately built and alert person with a respiratory rate of 26 per minute, saturation 96% at room air. Pulse rate was around 94 with BP 130/80. On general and systemic examination, he had grade 3 clubbing, and RS examination showed bilateral and inspiratory Velcro crackles in the lung basis on chest auscultation. All other systems were normal. So we did his blood investigations and ruled out any CTD. Of course, for that age, it was unlikely. But however, blood investigations were all within normal limits. Chest X-ray revealed bilateral reticulonodular opacities in the lower lung fields. The PFT and DLCO was done, which showed a moderate restriction with significant diffusion impairment. HRCT showed a usual interstitial pneumonitis pattern suggestive of IPF. And a 6-minute walk test, he had desaturated up to 92%, covered around 420 meters. So we had a diagnosis actually of interstitial pulmonary fibrosis by CT itself. So we did not proceed further for any transbronchial lung biopsy or surgical lung biopsy. And we started with tablet perfindone and antifibrotic. Initial dose was 200 milligram TDS. Later we slowly escalated to 400 milligram TDS. Finally, up to 600 milligram TDS, which he was able to tolerate. Tablet N-acetylcysteine Mucinex was given 600 mg TDS over 1 year. Tablet PAN40 was given because he has symptom of reflux also. GERD were there. So we had given him twice daily. We had given him Duolin Rotacaps with bronchodilator as this one and anticholinergic for his secretions thrice daily. Multivitamin and calcium supplements were given. Regular monitoring was done every 3 months for 1 year and with mild symptom improvement. However, though we monitored closely, he used to come regularly for his follow-up visits and he was very religious with his treatment. Compliance was good. Adherence to the medication was also good. In spite of that, in March 2019, he had an acute exacerbation of IPF with worsening of the respiratory failure. It was always a type 1 respiratory failure. He was admitted in ICU. His echo was repeated. CT was also done, which showed a progression of the disease with more of ground glassing with moderate pulmonary hypertension. So we treated him with higher antibiotics. We had to give parenteral steroids and diuretics. He was initiated on NIV support for the work of breathing. His routine medication was continued. He was discharged after 3 weeks on home oxygen therapy, and also home physiotherapy and breathing exercises were taught. His son, being a physiotherapist, also helped us, and he continued the same at home. In October 2019, he presented to us with further clinical deterioration. He had a worsening of dyspnea with MRC grade 5 and persisting cough. Dependence on caregivers was, even for ADLs, was increased. Here was an acute depression, and anxiety was also there with episodes of panic episodes in between. Discussion with caregivers was done with all medical surgical options, including and also palliative referral was also considered. Treatment was continued. In addition, we had thought with our palliative care person, we discussed, and he just started morphine 5 mg twice daily. But because we as pulmonologists were very apprehensive of the dose, and only 10 mg tablet was available, so we just coded it and we gave him with Alprax 0.25 milligram at bedtime and Bisacodyl syrup at 15 ml to avoid the constipation. However, with all these also in December 2019, his condition was worsening. Patient developed right-sided pneumothorax with severe cough, managed with ICD. He was shifted to ICU. He was initiated on NIV support. But however, the attenders were not willing for any ventilatory support because we have already explained to them the prognosis. And so DNI consent was given by attenders. And further on, actually, during that episode, he succumbed with worsening of respiratory failure. So psychosocial aspects are the struggling to get a diagnosis for 1 year, actually wherein he was treated as COPD and other respiratory infections. And he had a loss of life. He was a very active person and he used to go to his religious this one regularly. He had loss of life he previously had with limitation of activity and social isolation. Loss of independence, caregiver stress was also much. And living with IPF, like he started having increasing breathlessness. So he used to struggle with increasing breathlessness for minimal activities, struggling with cough, and struggling with fatigue, tiredness, and lethargy, struggling with anxiety and depression and panic episodes in between. He was living with oxygen continuously. Actually, he was on oxygen, he couldn't remove, and his requirement went on increasing. Even at rest, he used to require in the late stage 8 to 10 liters. With minimal exertion, it was increased to 15 liters. Hoping for a successful treatment, how to manage the acute worsening of dyspnea and cough at home, because the attenders were also tired of getting him to the doctor every time, and contact numbers of care providers in an emergency. So other psychosocial aspects were his impaired quality of life, an active person who was 3 years before, and today he has been almost stage 4 dyspnea, wherein even for minimal activities he had to depend on caregivers. Worsening of dyspnea was there, persisting cough. There were a lot of side effects of the medication, especially perfindone. I couldn't push beyond 600 TDS, which itself was quite high for him. And in addition, he had also impaired quality of sleep because of anxiety, fatigue, and exhaustion affecting the daily activities. We had to talk about advanced care planning, but actually we were not being a palliative myself at that stage, but we tried to involve the palliative person in our team. And he had discussed with them actually the need of the advanced care in such cases. Cost of medical care was also escalating because of repeated hospitalizations, and also the cost of oxygen therapy and the tablets as such. Caregiver stress was also there, so they had to totally shift from their hometown to the place so that it will be closer to his to our institute, so that we can give him better care and admit him more frequently. Decrease libido, reduce social activity, and yet the fear of death. So the medications was both, we tried pharmacological and non-pharmacological treatments. So pharmacological, as I had highlighted earlier, tablet perfindone. To start with, we started with 200 mg TDS, slowly escalated to 600 mg TDS. We had given him N-acetylcysteine 600 milligram TDS, and it was and tablet pan was given 40 mg BD with Duolin Rotacaps. Tablet morphine, as I had told, was added actually almost in the end stage with 5 mg BD when his breathlessness is not responding to all the therapy. And in addition, tablet Alprax was also given at bedtime, syrup isocodil, 15 ml at bedtime. The non-pharmacological measures were like we gave pulmonary rehabilitation, we taught him breathing exercises, oxygen therapy initially to start 2 to 4 liters, he was okay, and during active exertion we used to increase to, told him them to increase to 8 liters per minute. In addition, actually, we had given him psychological counseling, took my help of the clinical psychologist, and we also resorted to some cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety and panic attacks. Vaccination, he was given influenza and pneumococcal vaccinations. The main concern was the treatment should include the use of all modalities available, like not only pharmacological, because often we have the tendency to give pharmacological only. But in these sort of cases of chronic respiratory diseases, there is a lot of non-pharmacological treatment in addition to psychological, palliative and social support. Challenges induced by the end-stage ILD concerns the patient's entire family and immediate care providers to manage the acute worsening of a clinical status at home, which doesn't happen so much in our country because we can tell the attenders who are educated, can always teach them how they can manage the worsening state instead of getting into the hospital every time. Palliative care should be a part of a complete treatment plan right from the beginning, to use a team approach to address the needs of the patients and their families, including the counseling part and improving the quality of life, and thereby actually a positive approach towards the course of the illness. So to summarize, we had a patient of 66-year-old male diagnosed as a case of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis with acute and chronic respiratory failure, pulmonary hypertension, who was managed with mucolytics, oxygen therapy, morphine, anxiolytics, pulmonary rehab, palliative approach, who finally passed away in the ICU 2 years after the diagnosis. So our discussion point should be how early to refer for the palliative care services patient of chronic respiratory failure. Second is how to train the caregivers for acute worsening and for crisis and unanticipatory dyspnea management at home. And availability of low dose morphine, many a times it's not available in most of the centers and we have to score the tablet. When to discuss with the patient and caregivers regards advanced care planning like ICU and ventilator and end of life care issues. Thank you.
Sunil, do you want to answer or should I attempt? First of all, thank you very, very much, Dr. Anupama. I mean, I'm so delighted to see that your palliative care team was involved and that the patient managed to die in peace, not on the ventilator. So thank you so much. It really is heartening for me. It was like a case presentation in a hospital ward, which I did 30 years ago. But I'm so glad to include the palliative care. So just to answer your discussion points between me and Sunil, we'll take it from here. Very, very important is to realize the need of palliative care in respiratory diseases. Very, like I started in the beginning, it's always thought that palliative care is cancer. What is the role in non-cancer? So the fact that we have understood that palliative care is not just for cancer is the first battle. The second is the most crucial part is in the diagnosis of cancer. It's an emotional diagnosis where the patient automatically starts thinking of death. When you diagnose somebody cancer, he's already thinking, how many days I have to live or what I'll have to do. While if you diagnose a patient with a non-cancer diagnosis like COPD, like interstitial lung, he doesn't perceive it as life limiting. He perceives it as, now the doctor will treat me. Okay, I have got this diagnosis. Now he'll give me inhalers, I'll treat me. So 3 years ago, when I was only a pulmonologist, I used to never tell patients that COPD is incurable. I am treating your symptoms. So these are the kind of conversations and things you need to start telling your patients as from the beginning as possible. Second, there is a beautiful paper, which I'm sure Sunil can share it with you, called as the Gold Standard Framework. Now, Gold Standard Framework is a document which gives you indicators of starting palliative care discussions in each and every condition. Respiratory, cardiac, Parkinson's, MND, dementia, renal. So that, for example, in a COPD patient, there are 5 or 6 indicators and patient has to satisfy more than 2. Age more than 75, multiple hospital admissions, change in the PFT status, on 24-hour oxygen, DLCO value, FEV1 value, FVC value. So if the patient has any or multiple comorbidities. So if the patient has any 2 of that, it is time for proactive palliative care discussion, which means you do a shared care. The pulmonologist, patient and the family, and the palliative care, so that the patient is not abandoned. It's not like pulmonologist finished his work, now go to palliative. It should not be like that. Because suddenly when the patient is critical, his pulmonologist leaving his hand is the worst thing that can happen to a patient. So it has to be a shared, integrated approach, which gives you at least 1 year of overlap for you to build a rapport with the patient. So the question which has been researched in England is a surprise question, which is, will you be surprised if this patient sitting in front of you will not be alive in the next 1 year? If you are not going to be surprised, it is time for proactive palliative care. Because very often I have had patients who have walked out of the room saying, what is this, madam? You're talking of my death. I am to feeling fine. So this is where the onus of the doctors come, because you have seen more COPDs. You have seen more ILDs. You know how they fall. So your onus is to foresee and foretell that in my experience, out of the 10 patients, 8 behave like this. I don't know whether you're in the 8 or the 2. It is my duty to inform you so that you can make an informed decision, and I will support you with the palliative care team. So the surprise question is, if you will be surprised if this patient is not alive in the next 1 year, Gold Standard Framework has clear indicators of when to start this dialogues. So that answers us how early to refer. The earlier you refer, the better it is, because unfortunately in our medical training, we are not taught how to talk. Communication is the last skill taught to us. Secondly, we are not taught to talk on death and dying, because we doctors are next to God. We save lives, we cure people, we don't let anybody die. So that is the other problem that we have, that we are so megalomaniac that how can we talk about death? So it is important that we, in fact, if you see all the systems, how many systems may be able to cure illnesses? We cure infections. We don't get patients back to original quality of life. We control diabetes, we control dyslipidemia, we control blood pressure, we control asthma, and we cannot cure COPD, ILD, pulmonary hypertension, so many things, cirrhosis, renal failure. So we need to accept the fact that doctors are not there just to cure and save. We must be there to comfort and care. So does that answer your first and second question about when to start referral?
Yes, ma'am.
Sunil,
Yes.
you want to add something?
I think that is fine, madam.
And how to train for acute worst. Now this is how I do it in Bombay, where I cannot be in 5 different places. Is I discuss the GP. The family doctor of the patient is on a call with me and the patient. So the family doctor has explained that this situation is an advanced case of COPD, advanced case of ILD. This patient has expressed interest of not wanting aggressive treatment. So in a case of an emergency, we will do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I share the protocol with him on an email so that he can start the morphine, he can give haloperidol, he can give the midazolam, he can increase the oxygen, he can use the NIV, etc. Now, we are lucky that we get morphine in this state, and it's only one place in the city, but we still get it. And even during the lockdown, we have got it. If you don't get the morphine, you can use fentanyl in a hospital setup. You can use patches in a home setup if the patient is affording. Please believe me, the patches are much more expensive. Don't use it on a poor patient. They take 12 hours to kick in. But there are options. You can use fentanyl. You can use the patch, that fentanyl patch. And when to discuss with patient and caregivers regarding advanced care planning, etc. At the same time. So once you start telling them that this, what do you know of your illness? Have you all heard about the SPIKES protocol in communication? You've had a class? Not yet?
I finished classes on communication.
Anyway, just to let you know, it's a good idea to find out what the patient and family know about their illness. Then to tell them that this is your illness, it is incurable, it is progressive. We are treating your symptoms. We cannot remove this, cure this illness forever. Because this illness is going to progress, you need to think about the fact that when the outcome of aggressive treatment is poor, would you still like to go through it? Because our duty is to inform them. It is their duty to decide. And we have to support them in that decision. So it takes time. It will not happen in one conversation. That is the reason the surprise question and the gold standard framework gives you enough time. I always equate it to pregnancy. Now, in pregnancy, the lady has 9 months to prepare herself mentally, physically, emotionally for the labor pain. She doesn't panic at 9 months. Now, oh God, now what has happened? What is this pain? So the family is also constantly aware that at 9 months, this is going to happen. Similarly, when you have a patient of advanced lung disease, the time that you keep talking about it then becomes second nature. They don't panic in an emergency because they're aware of the fact. But in this is your communication skill. You really need to know how to talk, when to talk, how much to talk, with whom to talk, and the compassion and empathy with which you talk. Because honestly, patients come to know if you're caring about them or you're just doing your usual job. So I think the biggest advantage I have received by becoming a palliative pulmonologist is the fact that I can communicate to the patient that what I'm telling him is in his best interest, following the medical ethics of autonomy, and want to cause him least harm, and therefore be a support to the patient and the family. Is that okay, Sunil?
Yes, sir. Low dose morphine, yeah, the strength of morphine available is usually it's 10 milligram tablets. But at some places, morphine solutions are available that contains 1 ml in 5 milligram. But so it is difficult to score the tablet, but we can do that. And actually, you can advise the patient to take a tablet and make it into 4 pieces and take it maybe if they are taking 6 hourly, then 1 tablet is enough for a day. So if you want to start at a low dose, that's the possibility. And morphine availability is another problem in many states, but I think it's gradually improving. So, Dr. Anubhav, do you
Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
anything else? Anything else?
And most of the hospitals don't have this concept of palliative care still in this one.
Yeah.
So that is the reason that most of us, as in my pulmonology, this one, I am now teaching my postgraduates also more of palliative care.
Excellent.
And we have only 2 people who are trained. And now we have a Cancer Foundation. So from there, some palliative people have come and joined us.
Yeah.
So they are helping us out.
I feel that in the current COVID context, the need for palliative care is even more, and you don't need specialist palliative care. Everybody should be trained to wear a palliative care hat because COVID pandemic has brought death and dying into very sharp focus. Sudden, and it's very acute. There's no time to build a rapport. Our respiratory patients give us time to build a rapport, and yet we don't do it. But in the COVID pandemic, being a humanitarian crisis with volumes of patients being affected at the same time, there are places where there's 1 ventilator and 5 patients. You have to use your moral, ethical decision making into giving an appropriate patient that with proper communication. So you have to be trained. I think every doctor needs to wear a palliative care hat. It's not rocket science. It's just to polish the empathetic and compassionate form of medicine, which is fast disappearing from this world. So I think that is the whole significance of bringing back humanness into medicine. Because modern medicine talks about ventilator, ECMO. Proudly they say SP Balasubramanian was on ECMO. But what is his life going to be after that? That is also important. He can afford it, so everything is being done. But how is he going to live? Is it enough to just exist, or he should have a decent quality of life? So these are the questions, because today nobody stands in front of the altar and prays to the God that please keep me in ICU, please keep every tube in my orifice, but keep me alive. What do we all pray for? We pray for a painless death, right? We pray for least suffering. Yet, we subject all our patients to this and all our ICUs are full. We really need to focus on why we have become doctors and nurses and what are we offering. Is it only cure? We need to offer much more than that to our patients. So I will end with just one sharing of what I did as a palliative care physician. Yesterday, I have had a 73-year-old lady who was admitted for being COVID positive in the ward. She had mild symptoms and then she became fine and she was ready for discharge. I get a panic call from the ward saying in the time that she has been in the hospital, she has lost 2 sons, aged 50 and 40 to COVID, and she's unaware that both are dead.
Yeah, what happened?
She was going to go back home with both her children. I mean, out of the 3, 2 sons dead. And I thought to myself as to, I have not even treated this human being. She doesn't know me. I will go into the ward with PPE. How is she even going to recognize me? And what is medical about this? But when I saw her, I realized, imagine being in her situation with having had 3 sons 15 days ago, now reduced to 1 son. And at 73, she survived the COVID and the 2 children have died. And I went in with her daughter-in-law, broke the bad news, waited with her before I could discharge her. And then I get this huge email just thanking me for just being there physically and helping the family deal with such a difficult news. So you can make a difference. It's not always drugs. It's not always ventilator. Your words, your presence, your support makes a big, big deal. So just be you yourself. All of you have a heart, and all of you have, everybody has a beautiful nature to learn from. I think just we need to show that now more than ever during this humanitarian crisis. That's my simple request to all of you. Sunil, anything else? Over to you.
Do you use Prenoxin?
Sorry.
Do you use?
Let time also. So I should let all of you go.
Hello, madam.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Dr. Sunil, your voice is badly breaking.
Thanks, Dr. Rajam. It was really enlightening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rajam, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you for the chance. Thank you for the opportunity.
Such a beautiful patient story, which was very suitable for this session. And thank you all for a very interactive session. Thank you all.
Nice meeting you, Dr. Anupama, virtually. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye, Raji.
Bye, ma'am.
Dr. Anupama? Dr. Anupama?
Yes. I'm very
I think you have one Dr. Ramamurthy who is